Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Lots of friendly faces, lots of people we know. My name is Carolina Caballero. I am the Associate Director of the Cuban and Caribbean Studies Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to the third installment of our speaker series that we've been running this spring semester on contemporary Cuba. The series and our invited speakers are inspired by recent events on the island. The Cuban government recently initiated intense economic reforms in preparation for and immediately following the eradication of their two currency system. The country is attempting to reorganize both economically and socially, having suffered an increasingly tense and hostile relationship with the US under the Trump administration, which not only stopped but turned back Obama's normalization process. And this culminated with Cuba's return to the list of state sponsors of terrorism on January 11th. And finally, there have been a number of recent protests of various groups, among them artists and intellectuals, calling for freedom of expression and freedom of dissent. And of course, the government has responded vigorously and in some cases aggressively to the members of this movement. So we set out to invite Cuban scholars and experts, and it turns out that all of them are related or have some kind of relationship with Cuba. I'm sorry, with Tulane in some way, to explain what is going on and what it means for the island and the revolutionary project's future. So thank you very much for being here. And today I am very excited, and it is my pleasure to welcome today's guest speaker, Professor Laura Zoe Humphreys. LZ is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Tulane University. She completed a joint PhD in anthropology and cinema and media studies, and her research reflects this dual training, combining interest in cinema and the public sphere, digital technologies and media piracy, media anthropology, and post-socialism. Her monograph, Fidel Between the Lines, Paranoia and Ambivalence in Late Socialist Cuban Cinema, published by Duke University Press in 2019, tracks the changing dynamics of social criticism and censorship in late socialist Cuba through a focus on cinema. She is currently working on a Winter Grin funded project on digital media piracy, transnational media, and urbanism in Cuba. And her writing has also appeared in the journal Social Texts and Mediopolis, a journal of cities and culture. LZ today is, the title of her talk is 27N Censorship and the Role of the Intellectual in the Cuban Revolution. And this talk is timely and important. LZ will contextualize for us the current 27N or 27 de Noviembre movement within a longer history of Cuban artists and intellectuals' efforts to counter censorship and negotiate a new relationship between dissidents and revolutionaries and between Cubans on the island and the diaspora. Addressing key historical events such as the 2007 Guerra de los Vines, or the email war, in which Cuban intellectuals and artists first made collective use of digital technologies to protest censorship. Humphreys also asks how 27N, this current movement, both reproduces pre-existing tactics and indicates new dynamics in the relationship between Cuban intellectuals and the state. So LZ has a PowerPoint prepared that will provide us a timeline with the origins and development of this latest kind of crisis, I guess, that we could call it many other things, these protests, this crisis, and a summary of her preliminary ideas, as this is really a work in progress. The presentation will take about 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions. In the meantime, you're welcome to post questions or comments in the chat, and then we can address them at the end. So LZ, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me get back up to this PowerPoint, and again, so can you just confirm that I've opened it to? Okay.
Yes.
Good. All right. So thank you, Carolina, for both the invite and the challenge to get this talk organized. You know, this has been a very deep dive into social media and state press. And I've really enjoyed it. And I'm very much hoping, I think Carolina really made this quite clear, but my goal here today is to give us some background and then some theoretical tools to think about current events, but then really try to give us some some sort of common ground so that we can have a collective and collaborative conversation about it. So for those of you, I think many of you will be aware of these events, but just to get started, on this cover page, you are already looking at, the protest that gave this movement its name. A protest on the 27th of November, where an estimated 300 Cuban artists and intellectuals, most of them young, although not all, and I think that's significant as well, gathered outside of Cuba's Ministry of Culture in Havana to protest state repression of members of the Movimiento San Isidro, which is a group of oppositional artists and activists. So while dialogue between government officials and protesters has rapidly degraded, this protest and its aftermath have again reignited efforts to combat censorship and fight for greater freedom of expression among Cuban artists and intellectuals. So this is why we think of this as quite significant. So again, I'm going to start with these historical antecedents, and then I'll go into this timeline and some preliminary ideas. So for the historical antecedents, I'm drawing on work that I completed in my first monograph that Carolina mentioned. Here it is its beautiful cover right here. We worked very long and hard on this, the Duke University press designer and I think a number of you who are familiar with Cuban cinema will recognize that image. But the question that I was working with throughout the project, which really started as a dissertation and then moved into the book, was just how have Cuban filmmakers produced films critical of Cuban reality while also negotiating or navigating their dependence on larger structures, including the state, and then in the post-Soviet era, the global market. And part of what happened is that I was often trying to ask these questions about social criticism, and then filmmakers and intellectuals and artists would get annoyed with me for asking these questions. So in a way, the sort of like the goal of the research or of the writing became, why were people getting annoyed with this question? But also, why was it on the one hand that, films were constantly being marketed as being so critical? Like there'd be all these rumors about how critical X or Y film was. And then there would be at the same time, all these arguments about it, arguments about, why a film was not sufficiently critical, or it was complicit with the global market, or it was complicit with the state. And so I was really interested in analyzing why these sort of later arguments became the things that would get said about films and what that was doing to debate. And this quote right here is from, at the time in 2008, a 30-something filmmaker. I start the book with this quote, and he was describing how at the time he lived on the island, now he lives in Spain, but he was describing how when he went abroad to present his films, people would often kind of tell him, that he would say things about the island and people would say, well, you have no opinion, or anything you say is just replicating the state because you have no freedom. And so then his answer to this, as he was describing it to me, was to say, well, what freedom of expression are they talking about when they won't let me voice my opinion? He was feeling that people abroad and arguing that he lived in this totalitarian regime and therefore had no sort of autonomous opinion at all, were themselves shutting down his freedom of expression. And then he said this statement that I've heard numerous times from various intellectuals and filmmakers, which is that the best way to survive in Cuba is to refuse to be part of either group, right? To refuse to be part of either those who are like very pro the state and very pro communism in a very restrictive way, and also to refuse to be part of, the sort of explicit opposition. So it was this attempt to navigate this kind of more ambivalent position, and then the sort of closures that happened around that became very interesting to me in the book. All right, so this feels reductive as someone who wrote a long book, but to present the simple version of what my conclusions were, I kind of had three of them, which is one, that filmmakers have historically often turned to allegory to depict ambivalence about socialism in the Cuban Revolution. That in particular with sort of filmmakers who are working on the island, in state institutes, but also independently, that often, they were holding on to certain kinds of promises of the revolution, but critical of many state policies and that frequently films were sort of aimed at expressing that kind of ambivalence. But at the same time, that this ambivalence was repeatedly coming up against paranoid readings, that spectators would approach films and with a sort of argument of, well, it's either for the regime or it's against the regime, it's either for socialism or it's against socialism. And that the filmmakers that I was working with often felt that that was a very reductive way of viewing both the arguments and then also viewing art. Hence, I would say, the sort of frequent resistance to questions about criticism. So, my third conclusion here then became that new openings for public debate in the post-Soviet era both enabled greater criticism in films and also exacerbated political paranoia. So there are these new openings, and this includes the opening to the global market, which means that filmmakers can become increasingly independent of the state. Also, the rise of digital technologies, again, encourages this independence. But at the same time, it kind of multiplied the reasons for which you could be deemed suspect, right? Like all of a sudden, maybe it was not just that you were reproducing state rhetoric, but it was like being critical of the state could itself be propaganda for the state. I'll explain that in a second. Or that perhaps a film was doing nothing but marketing an image of deteriorating socialism to a global market. And kind of trying to pitch in on that. So part of what, and I should say a couple things here, which is just that by paranoia, I'm really drawing on writings and theories of political paranoia that have been worked out in anthropology, also in literature. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick is really important to me here. And so from this view of paranoia, we are not treating it dismissively. One of the sort of edited volumes around paranoia talks about paranoia within reason, that there is frequently a foundation, a real foundation to sort of political paranoia. The difficulty can become that it exaggerates things or that it creates too tightly wound narratives of causality. And what was really concerning to me was that it felt like all this ambivalence and nuance that is there in the films, that is there in how artists and intellectuals are feeling about Cuba, was continuously getting erased and was continuously getting kind of set into this really polarized political sphere that was itself really detrimental to dialogue about the nation. And I kind of write about this in the book, and I worry that I was too prescient in this, where I say, we want more options than just an authoritarian neoliberalism as the state opens up, but keeps money for the elite, or Trumpism. And here I was really thinking about Adriana Hernandez Regon's work about sort of growing support for Trump in Miami. And unfortunately, I feel like these two poles just keep recurring. So, my point here is just that this is an impoverishment of political imagination that can be really detrimental to the future of Cuba, and frankly, that the United States is living in very important parallels. Okay. All right. I need to explain Palabras a los Intelectuales real quick, just because it comes up in all of these debates. But Palabras, 1961, Fidel Castro responds at the end of the sort of long meeting with Cuban artists and intellectuals with this speech, in which he utters the sort of famous lines, dentro de la revolución todo, contra la revolución nada. And this is really instrumental in kind of creating the foundation of politically paranoid public sphere in Cuba. All of a sudden, both figuring out what is inside the revolution and what is against it is very complicated. But also throughout the speech, he keeps referring to honest versus dishonest intellectuals, to revolutionaries versus counter-revolutionaries. So I think it really quickly links what is in an artwork to the sort of morality of the people who are producing it. And that lays the groundwork for this paranoia. Okay. But I also wanted to argue that there is this change, and this relates to what I was just saying about new openings. So who I found extremely helpful to think about this was Herbert Marcuza in particular, although also related to Miklos Harashti. But Herbert Marcuza makes this argument in the 1970s in which he was kind of honestly in favor of a model that the Cubans adopt. But I found that his criticism of liberal media starts to apply to Cuba's state socialist media in the present moment, in which he's sort of making this argument that we need to understand that liberal media is not operating through a straightforward repression, but rather through repressive tolerance. Sure, I will let your article that disputes the system come into view, but only so long as it is couched in all of these ways that make sure that it doesn't destabilize the system. And so this was the kind of strategy that I was seeing in the post-Soviet era and thinking about as really also playing an enormously important role in the Cuban public sphere. So some examples that I talk about in the book, I'm going to flip through these real fast, but Fresa de Chocolate, viewed by some people as a win against state repression, but by others as propaganda for the Cuban state, making it look more critical than it really was. Juan de los Muertos as like, on the one hand, being viewed as extremely critical, but on the other hand, the protagonist chooses to stay in Cuba, even at the risk of his own life. And is that a strategy of containment? And with that argument, I actually was interviewing spectators as they were leaving the theater and sort of finding that they all wanted to come back to that argument and had really sort of interesting and diverse ways of seeing it. Okay. And then very relevant to current events, I also have a chapter where I talk about La Guerra De Los Vines. And this very briefly was a moment when the head of the National Cultural Council, Luis Pavon, in the 1970s, Luis Pavon Tamayo, appeared on state television. It was important because it was this first moment in which intellectuals moved to digital technologies in order to denounce censorship. And you can even see this happening like in the way that the emails are written. People will sort of say, well, I meant to send this to one individual, but I realized I should send it to more individuals. So they're addressing this one individual, but then circulating it more broadly. So it's like this very incipient public sphere that happens. But at the same time, there is this this repressive tolerance occurred in a couple of different ways. First, the UNIAC, supported, published a declaration in Granma that technically supported the intellectuals, but that, as a matter of fact, failed to specify what they were arguing about in any kind of real way whatsoever. So it is this sort of repressive tolerance, like we're allowing the debate to happen, but at the same time, really containing it by virtue of leaving the vast majority of the public completely confused about what was happening. And then similar sort of concerns were levied against an academic style meeting among selected intellectuals and cultural institutions that was organized by Desiderio Navarro at the Casa de las Americas, because here only some people were allowed into this room because there were too many people. His explanation was there's too many people who wanted in, so he couldn't let them all in. So then he let the institutions choose. And then that was viewed as itself, kind of a repressive tolerance. Yes, we're having this debate, but it's being contained. And then finally, there was a whole number of, sort of different views of what was causing censorship, whether this was the result of a few bad bureaucrats and dogmatists, the language of intellectuals on the island, usually an older generation, or whether it is the result of a totalitarian regime fostered by Castro. So this led to all these kind of mutual accusations of complicity on the part of intellectuals involved in this debate. I particularly love this quote, and I think it's relevant to current events, because Haroldo Dio Afonso, who himself was living abroad, talked about how intellectuals everywhere, no matter where they are always calculating what is and isn't judicious to say. So I feel that this email, this sort of point was pointing to the fact that there is no such thing as totally free speech, really. We are all indebted to particular institutions and so on. And what's interesting in the Cuban case is how that indebtedness becomes this sort of debilitating factor that is constantly being brought into paranoid view, to put it in that way. All right, so that brings us to 27N, and I'm going to go quickly through these timeline of events. But the first event, the thing that sort of unclenches this, is on November 6, 2020, when Cuban rapper Denise Solis Gonzalez films a police officer who entered his home and transmits the exchange live over Facebook. This is available over YouTube. I suggest that you take a look at it. What's interesting is that the cop comes into his home and Solis kind of says, "What are you doing coming into my home without permission?" The cop kind of gestures at the space, and it was like, "Un pasillo," like this is a hallway, not a home. And I'm like, I have no idea where he lives, but this is a pasillo. And then Solis responds to him, again, insists that he needs to leave, and then kind of follows this up with homophobic insults against Raul Castro and the officer, and then states Donald Trump 2020, and says that Donald Trump is his president. And then the police officer takes out a cell phone and takes images of Solis before leaving. Okay. So a few days later, on the 9th, when Solis finally leaves his home, he's arrested and he's condemned 72 hours later to 8 months of prison for desataco, or contempt of authority, which is targeted against, or my understanding is that this is being presented as his contempt of authority of that specific police officer. I'll come back to why I think that's important. On the 18th, members of MSI, or the Movimiento San Isidro, which is an oppositional movement of artists and intellectuals founded in 2018 in response to the controversial Decreto Ley 349, which was viewed as by many as an effort to institutionalize censorship. Some of them go on a hunger and thirst strike. And this group includes artists, importantly, includes artists such as Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara, who had himself been arrested in March 2020 for property damage and for performance art piece in which he documented himself wearing the Cuban flag in various locations. Okay. On the 26th, so about a week later, Facebook services are disrupted, or members of MSI record that Facebook gets disrupted. And at that point, state officials come into their headquarters and detain members on the argument that a journalist who had just arrived from Mexico and had joined the group was contradicting COVID-19 violations, or regulations, pardon me. So this is Luis Manuel in one of these sort of performance art pieces. On the 27th, after the arrest or the detention of some of these members of MSI, an estimated 300 artists and intellectuals come and protest outside of the Ministry of Culture. And again, I sort of said at the beginning, like the majority of these protesters are young, but those gathered also include older and well-known artists from the world of cinema. For instance, director Fernando Perez and actor Jorge Perugorria, who you actually saw imaged in a few slides ago in Fresa de Chocolate. He was the main actor in Fresa de Chocolate. So this is really important, of course, because it gives this whole movement a much broader scope. It's sort of pushing out of those who have kind of self-identified as activists, as opposition, to the people who I describe in my book as being these ambivalent intellectuals, right? Who are, retaining some of these promises of socialism and so on, but also being critical. I think Fernando Perez and Jorge Perugorria really kind of represent that group. So 30 representatives from the group who gather on that night are selected and then are invited inside for a meeting with Vice Minister of Culture, Fernando Rojas. And they emerge from this meeting with preliminary agreements, which include: one, the Ministry of Culture will look into the cases of Denise Solis and Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara. Two, that there will be a channel for dialogue with cultural institutions opened up. Three, that a work agenda will be organized from both sides. And then four, that artists and intellectuals will be allowed to meet in independent spaces without suffering state aggression. So a number of protesters were pepper sprayed that evening, and part of the protest took place in a rather suspiciously timed blackout, but protesters were generally allowed to go home peacefully, and reports of the evening from, again, like a very wide spectrum of people, were mainly optimistic and extremely hopeful. Okay. On the 29th, so this is 2 days later, youth organizations hold a rally called Tangana en el Trío, Jóvenes por la Democracia Socialista, which was attended by President Miguel Díaz-Canel. He is quoted here of accusing the protesters of the previous night of putting on a media show, which is an accusation that keeps getting repeated throughout this whole sort of series of events. And he also claims that they were an unconventional strategy of war to destroy the revolution carried out by Trumpistas and the anti-Cuban mafia of the United States. Youth at the rally, meanwhile, are cited by journalists as saying things such as, quote, "There is space for dialogue here for everything that supports socialism and the revolution." I just want us to hang on to statements like that. So on December 4th, 27 organizers sent an email to the Ministry of Culture establishing their requirements for dialogue. And these include 1, the safety of participants, 2, the right to determine who will participate from the 27N side, 3, the presence of independent press so as to avoid an edited, quote unquote, read censored version of the conversation, and then 4, the presence of the President of Cuba and representatives from the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Justice. And the list of proposed participants that they sent includes controversial members of NSI, such as Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara, who, as I mentioned earlier, had previously been arrested in the spring on charges of desecration of national symbols for that art performance that I showed you an image from. The Ministry of Culture responds to this email by saying that by including representatives and press organizations who receive financing from the United States or from American organizations or who have desecrated national symbols, 27N has, quote, broken all possibility for dialogue. So their reason to cut it off is like, you know, people like Luis Manuel and then organizations like Periodismo del Barrio. Meanwhile, and I think this is important, again, you know, from this perspective of repressive tolerance, on December 5th, the Minister of Culture, along with Atilio Alonso, the Vice Minister of Culture, Fernando Rojas, and then a number of heads of cultural institutions meet with other young Cuban artists and intellectuals. And institutions claim that through this meeting, they have in fact held up their end of the bargain with 27N protesters. So here, you know, note, they're insisting, we are having dialogue. We're having the dialogue. It's just you all who are like, you know, putting up impossible demands. Okay. On January 27th, in this rather extraordinary event, artists affiliated with 27N had planned a small protest in commemoration, you know, also of Jose Marti's birthday, in which they were intending to read poetry in front of his statue. But after some are detained by police, they head to the Ministry of Culture. Vice Minister Fernando Rojas tries to persuade the protesters to enter the Ministry of Culture on the grounds of ensuring respect for COVID-19 regulations. I was really befuddled by how going inside was going to be better for COVID-19 than like staying outside. I'm like, that one really lost me. But, you know, he tries to get them to go inside, and perhaps that is significant as well in terms of this repressive tolerance tactics. Meanwhile, the Minister of Culture comes outside and then gets live streamed, knocking a cell phone out of the hands of a young independent journalist, Mauricio Mendoza of Diario de Cuba, and pushing him. Many involved claim that protesters were then forcibly made to get into buses and also abused. Following this, artists organized a petition with 1,200 signatures demanding the removal of the minister on grounds of behavior unbefitting a public official. And this petition gets rejected on legal grounds. Okay. And then just another couple of quick points in this timeline that I want to put out is that there is this list that gets published authorizing 2,000 plus small business activities, but prohibiting 127, which include independent journalism and private art galleries. And like notably, this means that they cannot operate as private businesses, right? So, you know, but what's interesting is this public declaration. It's one thing to be non-legal, it's another thing to be told that you are illegal. Okay, and then on the 10th, Alpidio Alonso launches a campaign, Tienes la Palabra, to commemorate the 60th, or you have your turn to speak, something like that, to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Palabras a los Intelectuales. All right, I'm running short on time, but I'm going to quickly go through these sort of proposed continuations. I'll stop we're good? Yeah, okay. So one thing that I would say is one continuity is this ongoing use of paranoia and repressive tolerance. And hopefully the use of paranoia is obvious from what I've already said. There's this repeat sort of move on the part of the state to accuse Denis Solis, MSI, and so on of being mercenaries or peons for the United States government, terrorists, or American millionaires such as George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. But at the same time, the tactics used by the state are not just that of overt repression and imprisonment. From the Vice Minister Fernando Rojas's agreement to meet with artists and intellectuals on the night of the 27th, to the Ministry of Culture's insistence that they fulfilled their part of the agreement by holding a meeting with young Cuban artists and intellectuals on December 5th. There are these continuous efforts on the part of state officials to insist that they're open to dialogue and debate, albeit with certain limits. And in this context, this resurrection of Palabras a los Intelectuales, under this motto of Tienes la Palabra, your turn to speak, is significant. So it at once insists on the rights of Cubans to participate actively in debate, while also resurrecting that long-standing limit to freedom of speech that bars those the state deems counter-revolutionaries from participation and dialogue. The other thing that is super important here is new generations and digital technologies. Notably, many of those who are most active here would have been at best in their early 20s or their mid-20s at the time of the Guerra De Los Vines, and probably would have been barred from that meeting that was held at Casa de las Americas. Also significant, the use of digital technologies. Digital technologies mean that, from live streaming to the use of social media, that there's this constant publicity of events that is outside, that really is kind of escaping the control of the state. There's a new opportunity here for publicity. I think it's also significant, and this relates to sort of an analyses by Jeffrey Juras of Occupy, of how social media lends itself to sort of emitting this kind of blast of information that gets bodies into a space. And so you see that on the 27th of November, but we've also seen it before in Cuba. And this is from this image is from May 13th, 2019, which was an impromptu LGBTQ march that got held after Cenesex had canceled its official march. And again, there was confrontation here between police and sort of activists in opposition. But it was an unauthorized march that was able to happen through the sort of blast of information that takes place through social media. At the same time, I don't think we want to get naive about what digital technologies can accomplish. The state is clearly sort of doing its best to come up with ways to respond to it. And some of these sort of traditional tactics, of course, include just cutting off social media at these key moments, right? Like there's a repeat sort of information that this is what they're doing. Part of what especially fascinates me is how the state is responding to these events through official state media. So I do have a clip from this, but I think I'll leave it for the discussion. But this image is from a 1.5-hour special episode of Canal Caribe that aired on November 28th. And in this image, the young news host for the special program displays a receipt that purportedly reveals purchases of food for MSI made notably desde el exterior, or from abroad, and then gets used as evidence that MSI was not, in fact, on a hunger strike. And there are all these other moments in this episode in which there's kind of a remixing of live stream videos or social media that protesters had sort of released that purports to show the true truth behind these events. And interestingly enough for me, does it as well with like this kind of really repetitive and soundtrack that almost sounds like the soundtrack for a really bad NCIS show. So there's this whole sort of genre of like detective and revelation of truth that is happening here. And this, of course, is media that really is going to reach all of the Cuban population. And that really throws the sort of account that protesters have put of events into doubt. So I think it's important to pay attention to things like this. I think another thing that was really important to me or impressive and new here is that just, like I said, state officials and state media are actively using paranoia to discredit activists and oppositional artists and intellectuals as mercenaries funded by the US government, anti-Cuba terrorists, or the NGOs of American millionaires. But there is an anti-paranoia campaign that is being carried out by the opposition as well, in a couple of cases, for instance, state media accused, independent journalists, or in another example, Spain and Argentina-based researchers of being sort of stooges for the United States because of the fact that they had received support from the George Soros Foundation, which is imaged here. So it's the Open Society Foundation. And then, those who were accused come out publicly in blogs on these independent journalist sites, sort of insisting that, yes, we have received foundation, but that does not mean that we are intellectually compromised or that we are just stooges for some foundation and its mission. I think there's a couple things that are interesting to me here, which is one, this is nonetheless a paranoia that is within reason, right? So, this is like in one of those kind of counters, the academics say, all you have to do is like look up the website. Well, I did. And when you look up the website, you see that the Open Society Foundation gives thousands of grants to groups and individuals who promote our values through a unique network that is guided by local voices and global expertise. I mean, I think this comes back to this point. There is no such thing as pure intellectual freedom or as pure autonomy. And so that leaves open this accusation that just because you are sort of affiliated with a particular institution, that you become nothing but a peon of that institution. I want to question that. I think one thing that I would also like to say is that I am really impressed by this anti-paranoia campaign on the part of artists and intellectuals. Is this anti-paranoia campaign going to get extended to people who are associated with Cuban state institutions as well? Because for me, I think that a true dialogue requires both of those moves to happen. Another final sort of big point that I want to make is just that there is an inclusive and also kind of legally oriented nature of demands that is happening here that seems new to me. So the protest on the 27th of November was sparked by quite specific concerns about the legal situations of Solis and Luis Manuel. But by the time intellectuals and artists had entered together with Fernando Rojas, they had begun to articulate these broader demands. And those included, as they were read by Catherine Bisquet, who's imaged here, these demands included the derecho a tener derechos, the right to have rights, freedom of expression and artistic production, the cessation of acts of hostility and defamation carried out by state media against independent artists, and an end to police violence and political hate. So I think what's important about the kind of broadly articulated demands is, again, how it potentially makes room for a great deal, for a great variety of intellectuals and artists across the political spectrum. And then also this constant recourse to the law is itself worth interrogating. From the new Decreto Ley 349 into the present, the state itself seems to be like putting more and more of these things that used to just happen informally into law. And then activists are kind of responding also through this kind of legal language, if, for instance, by pointing out contradictions between law and promises in the Constitution. And I think it's just going to be worth paying attention to seeing how that unfolds. Okay, I'm going to start up there so that we don't run out of time for conversation.
Great, thank you, Elsie. So we're going to open the floor for questions. Elsie, what the last couple of times what we've had is we've taken 2 or 3 questions at a time. Are you comfortable with that? And then kind of answering that way? Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Okay, great. Does anybody have any questions? or comments?
I have a question. This is Jose Codd. Professor Humphreys, thank you so much for your presentation, which I very much enjoyed. I apologize that my video is, for some reason, not working at the moment. I absolutely hate it when the video is off. During the course of your presentation, I would have loved for you to see my my acknowledgement, my facial expressions, and following your lectures. So I apologize for that. I'm interested in the point you made towards the end regarding the intersection with law and the legal system. And so would you elaborate some more on that? Did you see there something that will continue? Did you see other groups in Cuba sort of following that lead, if you will?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jose. Anybody else?
Yeah, I had a question about Cuban filmmakers, I guess, and to what extent there are independent productions versus state-sponsored productions. Several years ago, I heard a presentation by some Cuban internet filmmakers that was very, very interesting.
Anyone else have a question? Ariana, I think I do about this kind of really, one of the things that's striking to me about this latest, I guess, crisis, right, is that we have the Movimiento San Isidro, which is known for being, it's kind of this dissident organization, right? And as you mentioned, the filmmaker you talk to is the best place to be is in neither of those las dos bandas, particularly for filmmakers. And I know from working with Ana Lopez and the ICAIC has had normally more freedom in terms of how they express things. But now we have members of the ICAIC, we have theater practitioners, and they're siding with a group that is a known dissident group. And I feel like that's what makes all the difference for this. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about, I mean, I'm commenting and I'm questioning, right? Like, or do you think that makes a difference, right? That they are taking the side. In a lot of ways, they're not, I mean, they are supporting, and the fact that they're out supporting that movement, like now they've taken a side, right? They're not in the middle anymore, right? And how is that making a difference for this?
Yeah, I want to say that, let me like move through these things. Yeah, I'm going to start just with like sort of state production and independent production. At this point, I feel that in fact, more and more it's independent production, right? Juan de los Muertos, for instance, was like really kind of revolutionary because it was one of the first times that you had this sort of extremely well-funded, expensive sort of film that was made independently in Cuba, and those filmmakers really negotiated a very new relationship to the ICAIC. The ICAIC was involved, but what they did was that they navigated and they negotiated exhibition rights for the ICAIC. But they were sort of doing all of the international relations and the production and all of that, right? So this is important. And I started there because I think this relates to the law bit. And Jose, I'm with you. The bit on the law is actually the most fascinating to me. Unfortunately, it's also the thing that I'm like, what is going on? Like, I've got these tentative ideas, but like, I'm not entirely there. But like, here's my sort of very preliminary theory about this, which is just that, I mean, okay, so there's a whole number of examples. One, the Constitution is new. Like, there is a brand new Constitution. So there's this increasing emphasis, like on the part of everyone, including the state, on what rights and laws people have. And I'm at the most preliminary beginning of looking through this Constitution, but it's real interesting that according to the Constitution, Cubans have the right to assembly. Now we know that to not be true. But according to the Constitution, they have the right to assembly, so long as it is legal. And then I'm like, wait, so what law is regulating or determining when the right to assembly becomes legal? But this is like, I mean, that also produces like this really important point of contention. Like when you see the sort of, and you see like the possibility of digital technologies like that are really in this form, dating, I would say, only to 2018 with the rollout of 3G on phones, right? Like that is what gives you the possibility of getting hundreds of people into a space at once. And then all of a sudden you can say, well, the Constitution says we have the right to assembly. But at the same time, these sort of like marches or this presence is unauthorized. So it's like, it's opening up this whole new point for conflict and contradiction. And I do think that the independence, right, like the growing sort of movement of independence, the growing movement to state businesses, the decentralization of the economy, all of that is really essential to why we're seeing like, these new laws get written into place. One of the things that really strikes me and is fascinating is the kind of nostalgia that we hear for people, for the censors of yore, in particular for Alfredo Guevara. And in fact, like in the sort of meeting with like the oppositional intellectuals and artists with Fernando Rojas, I think it was Juan Pin who said, Alfredo Guevara, he repeats this argument that I've heard over and over again, is that like Alfredo Guevara was different from you people. Sure, he censored, but he would never let the police show up and you could talk to him. Now, I want to be real careful and insistent that I am not saying that Alfredo Guevara was objectively different from everyone we have in charge right now. What's interesting to me is a nostalgic belief that he was, and what that says about the sort of relationship, like what the kind of like patronage relationships were between intellectuals and the state in earlier years, and then how increasingly what we see as they grow more and more independent is that like this stuff goes into law. And then you no longer feel like you have your patron who you could talk to personally and so on, right? But I think that this is what we need to like watch out for. This whole 27N has been full of legal language. Like all of the activists and independent blogs are very concerned with demonstrating whether or not Denise Solis's arrest was in fact legal. And and it's just, that's really interesting. I think the law under which he's arrested is just highly problematic, and you really should see that live streaming. I mean, it really does feel a little bit like the cop walked accidentally into his home, and then he kind of responds to him in this way. But whatever, the sanction was too much. Okay. And then, this last bit, Carolina, I agree with you. I think it's super important that you're seeing suddenly people like Fernando Perez saying like, well, I'm not going to like set MSI to the side. I'm with MSI on this point. But I don't think it means the erasure of that ambivalence. And that is like, that's the thing that like, that's the reason, or for me, what will actually create dialogue or a non-impoverished political future for Cuba is to create a situation in which all of these voices across the spectrum are able to articulate themselves and be heard. But it is for sure a radical move away from the moment in La Guerra de los Vines. And like in the Guerra de los Vines, there's a lot of people who are already objecting to this language of like, criticism from within the revolution, or only revolutionaries get to debate. People were already challenging that. And now you have people like Fernando Perez or Jorge Perguria, and other sort of older actors, people who were always kind of critical from within, facing censorship themselves, really overtly saying, no, we need to like, there was one actor, Luis Alberto Garcia, on his personal social media, or no, in an interview, said, so long as they're not selling state secrets, then what do we care? Like, and I think that is very significant, because it is this sort of like embrace, or they're finding themselves in a position where they feel that they have to include and acknowledge people who are more on that activist oppositional end. Yeah. Okay.
So I know you can't see me, but I want the record to reflect that I'm nodding along and smiling and following all that you're saying with great approval and support.
Thank you so much.
Right. Well, I think also when you talk about these digital medias, right? Like, so for that actor to out and say, is like, as long as they're not selling state secrets, like you can't contain this, like the politics of containment. I mean, I'm sorry, the strategy of containment, like that's what's really in crisis as well, right? And in a lot of ways because of live streaming and getting everyone together in front of the Ministry of Culture, right? Like, there's only so much they can contain anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Or
yeah. Yes, I agree. Although I would also say that nonetheless, let us not be so naive as to think that digital technologies are just going to absolutely disrupt power structures. I mean, I think part of what fascinated me about this 1.5-hour television special is that it just seemed so ham-fisted. I'm like, have you guys not been watching Trump? Like, learn a thing or two. But on the other hand, I mean, it really was like through that whole television episodes, like they took Solis's live stream of the police officer entering his home, and then they edited it and intercut it with other live streams that he's produced where a police officer hands him a ticket. And that becomes their argument that the police officer who he launched these homophobic insults against, etc., was actually performing an active duty, delivering a citation to Solis himself. Right? So that in some ways is kind of clever, and maybe it feels ham-fisted to me, but there is this sort of reality TV show or NCIS kind of aesthetic to the whole thing, and it's going out over television, and perhaps that's quite compelling. And I did actually, I cut myself off from sharing this slide, but like I got in touch with my new project. I'm working on digital media piracy, and so that means I hang out a whole lot at coffee places. And one of my closest buddies these days is a guy who sells like household goods. So he's 30 something and he sells household goods. That's what he does. That's one of those like stands, in Havana. And I asked him what he thought about this. And he was like, well, I think that the protesters were doing the right thing, but the state very quickly let us know that they were mercenaries and were telling us that side of the story. And now nothing's like, it seemed for a second that something was going to happen, and now nothing very much is happening at all. It's all over. And I was like, so there's a perspective. I mean, I think that is just one example, but we know that information is getting out in a way that didn't used to be possible, and that's a major difference. But the real question here will be, who gets to control the spin?
Yeah. Could I ask one more question, if I may?
Sure.
So that a few years back, we had a group of musicians from New Orleans who went to Havana, Trombone Shorty and the Preservation Hall group, and they filmed that wonderful documentary, of course, and all that. Do you think these more recent developments will impact the ability of our musicians to go to Cuba and interact with artists in Cuba, and tied in with that, will there be an expectation that they show solidarity with the artists in Cuba relative to these political issues as well?
That's such an interesting question. I was there with those groups. It was amazing because I was heading into the field at the moment, and I was on the plane with them. And so then I ended up at a second line in Old Havana, and at and then also at like a show that the shows that they put on at the Fábrica del Arte. It was, I live in New Orleans. It moved my heart to be there with them. So I suppose what this is going to, I think maybe the question about musicians going to Cuba is almost more an American question, an American side question than a Cuba side question. When I did this deep dive through social media, part of the arguments on the part of the state that I saw against MSI and Solis was that they were siding with Trump, and Trump's sort of like asphyxiation of Cuba right at a moment when Biden is coming in and there's an opportunity for exchange. So that was interesting to run into, right? Because then you have like Cuban state officials insisting that the thing that we want is the exchange with the United States, and these oppositional, like these activists and so on, are the ones who are clamping down and making that impossible. So that I think was You know, that sort of indicates some support from the state for those kinds of cultural exchanges. In terms of artists, again, you know, I suppose what I really just want to insist on is, you know, it's such a small world, right? Like in the end, American artists are going to have to, like, they will make their own meaning out of all of this. And, you know, forgive my like cynicism, but they will make their own very naive meanings out of all of these arguments and so on. But like Luis Manuel is someone, like, I know Luis Manuel. Like, you can't move in Cuban and Havana art circles without knowing some of these people. But I do think, again, for me, the most encouraging thing that comes out of 27N is what Carolina was also saying, which is just this possibility for a much broader coalition, like one that actually does include and incorporate activists and oppositional intellectuals and artists, but is still sort of is associating them with people who are maybe more ambivalent about Cuban politics or about socialism and the promises of the revolution.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments? All right. Okay, Elsie, well, thank you very much for your time and your expertise on this.